During the Easter season, we hear about the growth of the early church after Jesus' resurrection. His rising from the dead has lasting impact upon us all. But it takes time for people to hear this good news and to be changed by it. So in this first reading, we have Paul and Barnabas. They're the first to bring the good news to different communities in Asia Minor, which is in today Turkey. In their first missionary journey, they traveled to 10 different communities. And the names may sound rather strange to us. Syrian Antioch, Seleucia, Salamis, Paphos, Perga, Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Italia. And that's because we don't live there. But for the people that did live there, those names were as familiar as Elgin, Rayville, Petersburg, Neely, Tilden, Clearwater, rural St. John's, and Ewing. They were sent as a pair, Paul and Barnabas, to this large group of towns. And it makes me think about our own parish grouping that's being formed of all those communities that I just mentioned. How Father John and I have been working together, and this summer, him to be pastor and me associate of first 6 parishes and then eventually all 8. As we see in this first reading, priests serving in pairs is a much more biblical model than priests serving in isolation. For as apostles, Paul and Barnabas, of course, are among the first priests. When they reached each of these communities, they would have preached the good news of Jesus' resurrection and the forgiveness of sins and new life that we have because of him. And then when people decided to follow this way of Jesus, then Paul and Barnabas would have celebrated the sacraments for these new Christians. Baptism, confirmation, and of course the Mass. Certainly as Paul and Barnabas moved from place to place, none of these communities immediately had resident priests, nor was there a consistent schedule of Masses. There weren't even church buildings yet. But of course, this is not that different from the beginnings of the church in our own area. When Catholics first moved to this part of Nebraska in the late 1800s, there were no church buildings. And the priests came very much like Paul and Barnabas as missionaries, serving many different communities. It was only afterwards, both here and in Asia Minor, that the churches and resident pastors were formed, especially as the rural populations began to increase and peak around the 1930s. So the pastoral planning and the parish grouping is a result of the subsequent population decline after that, as well as the fewer number of priests. In fact, our current rural populations are actually comparable to what populations were here in 1890. So if you think about it, for equivalent populations, we actually have more priests serving than then. For at that time, in 1890, there would have been 1 priest serving all the communities west of Norfolk. At least now we have 2 for 8. It's hard to imagine how 1 priest would have served so many. How did they do it? Well, just as it was in the case of Paul and Barnabas with those 10 communities, they would not have had Mass on every Sunday at every place. But when faced with that possibility that some of our communities in the very near future might not have a Sunday Mass, that was very painful for people to accept. Can't you do something, Father, to ensure that each of our churches continue to have Mass on Sunday? And so began the task of forming our 8 parish grouping. With 2 priests serving so many communities, just like Paul and Barnabas, we're forming a new way for us all to be served out of a centralized administrative office, and for each community to maintain a Sunday Mass. With 8 churches and 2 priests, each limited to only 4 Masses on a Sunday, that means that the final schedule will be 1 Mass per church. So after much deliberation, we can finally let you know what our Mass schedule to be during this first part, how it will change July 1st of this summer. So if we look at the two kind of ends of this grouping, so one priest on the weekend would have kind of the northern route, and so he would have Saturday evening at 5:30 at St. Peter's in Ewing, Sunday 10 a.m. at St. Teresa's in Clearwater, and Sunday 11:30 at Rural St. John's. So then the second priest would have the more southern route, would have Saturday evening at 7 p.m. in Petersburg, Sunday 8 a.m. in Rayville, and Sunday 10 a.m. here at St. Boniface. So that's the Mass schedule that we'll have starting July 1st. Now, you may have noticed that I said that as priests, we can say 4 Masses at most a weekend. So why did that schedule just have 3 for each of us? And if you listen, there seem to be spots there where the priest could have each of them another Mass. For example, down in the southern route. What about an earlier Saturday evening, like we currently have here? Well, those open spots are left there deliberately for when Neely and Tilden join our grouping. Then, each priest will have 4 Masses, and there'll be a Mass in each of those empty places. A number of parish representatives in the various meetings that we had encouraged us priests to change to this final schedule more right away, as much as we're able to. And that's why July 1st, those changes will take into account the final schedule. Certainly, some could look at this and say, but Father, why don't you just keep the earlier Saturday evening Mass here in Elgin in the meantime, and then it can be removed when the final 2 parishes come into the grouping? Well, we were encouraged by many of our parish representatives not to do that, since it would effectively mean an increase in the number of overall Masses being given, rather than what we've all been preparing for, the knowledge that there will be fewer. Also, it would make changing eventually to that final schedule all that much more difficult, having gone up and then even further down later. Finally, the needs of the parishes don't actually necessitate adding on a 4th Mass just for our 3 parishes. When we look at the statistics for average Mass attendance and the church capacities of all 8 churches, we actually find that every church can accommodate the total average Mass attendance with only 1 Mass each. So the goal is really to serve the real needs of the parishes, not simply to max out what a priest is able to do. Remember that there's many other needs outside of Sunday Mass that the priests are also taking care of. And having this period of time with, in one sense, a lightened Sunday schedule, 3 Masses rather than 4, can help take some of those pressures off of your priests so that we can succeed in establishing this new grouping structure before we inevitably add on the 4th Mass into each of our schedules. So some may respond to that schedule and say, but having only 1 Mass per parish doesn't really accommodate the different schedules that people have. But in reality, there are still many options for Mass times. For some, this might require a slight different way of thinking about the connections that we have among our different parishes. But for many of us, as the Mass survey that we took showed, a significant number of you are already willing to travel to the other parishes if a Mass time fits better into their specific schedule. Of course, if attending your own parish takes priority over the time, then of course we have the times at each parish. So I obviously can't go through all of the questions someone might have or through the process of how we decided the different details of the schedule. But we have put forth a kind of question and answer sheet that you'll find in your bulletin, as well as we'll have it in the newsletter coming out later this month. And it'll explain a little bit more that I can't right now. for those of you who know me, you can be assured that we definitely took in as much data and tried to come up with the most logical conclusion possible. Yes, we priests are aware that any change will involve feelings of loss. To lose even one Mass in a parish is difficult. But we know that sacrifice is part of the Christian life. Paul and Barnabas told these communities in their reading today that it's necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. See, God allows us to go through difficult things. So yes, it's painful, for example, for Elgin to lose one Mass, but the sacrifice allows your neighbors to have one as well. Through all this, I beg you to put aside any divisions. Don't live in opposition, one parish versus another. If you're losing your Mass, then don't blame someone else. If you're maintaining one where your church may have become a chapel, then be grateful for the generosity of others that have made it so. The second reading today reminds us that our earthly homes are temporary. The former heaven, the former earth had passed away. You see, as fruitful as Paul and Barnabas were in sharing the gospel in Asia Minor, less than 1% of those who live there today remain Christian. And many of those communities that are mentioned in that reading are nothing more than ruins. All of our earthly homes can change and pass away. But God does promise that wherever we may be, He will dwell with us, and we will be His people, and God Himself will always be with us as our God. Therefore, let us be kind and gracious to one another. As Jesus says in the gospel today, I give you a new commandment. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another.